Let's imagine that there was a breakout of very unusual hunger pains globally. Now, people got these hunger pains and then they got over them. And many people were really, really hurt by the hunger pains and we're very concerned for them and we're sorry. That's a fallen world that happens. We're not minimizing the damage. But let's say that these hunger pains can affect people, and over 99% of people who get these hunger pains will actually recover from the hunger pains and then have a special thing built in by God in their body to resist that hunger pain any longer. And let's imagine that the governing authorities produced a special healing cookie, and let's call it Joe's Cookies. The government decides that they want everybody to eat the cookie. And the government decides that it's going to become mandatory for you to eat these cookies. These are healing cookies. You must eat the cookie. Everybody eat the cookie. Did you get your cookie? Make sure you eat your cookie. Everybody has to have the cookie. Let's imagine for a moment now that the cookie is being given to everybody, and it's not just optional. It's not a voluntary thing, but everybody says you must eat Joe's Cookies because Joe's Cookies will ultimately save the world. We'll get out of the hunger pains disease if everybody just would eat their cookie. And let's imagine that the government goes from suggesting the cookie and saying things like, we would never, ever demand and make it mandatory that everybody eats the healing cookie because we don't have the authority to do that or to say that. They go from that months ago to saying everybody must eat the cookie to the degree that we will give men the death penalty for not eating the cookie. And what do I mean by death penalty? Well, here's what I mean. It is a modern version of the death penalty to tell somebody if they do not put the cookie into their body, they will not be able to work, earn money, feed their families. That is appointing them to death. It is saying you eat the cookie or you die. That's where we're at. So what is the Christian response to this?
Welcome to the Spirit and Muscle broadcast where faith meets fitness. I'm Young Gerald, certified personal trainer. And before we get started, I want to offer you a free gift, just to say thanks for hanging out with me today. The Spirit and Muscle Calorie Calculator Combo is a free resource with 3 free tools to help you succeed on your fitness journey. To learn more or to pick one up, go to spiritandmuscle.com/calories. That's spiritandmuscle.com/calories. The link is also in the description. You may be wondering why I'm talking about cookies. Well, this topic affects our health and fitness, so I want to respond from that perspective. And just as importantly, it affects us as Christian believers, so I want to respond to this biblically as well. First, a little about our featured speaker, Jeff Durbin of Apologia Church in Arizona. Their media arm is Apologia Studios, where they produce a podcast and the Apologia radio program. Jeff Durbin is also deeply involved in the fight to abolish abortion in our land with their ministry EndAbortionNow.com. And Jeff Durbin is known for his straightforward preaching and bold witness for Christ in the public square. This sermon on mandatory cookies was preached at Apologia Church on October 10th, 2021. In my video, I'll give you the highlights and summary of his hour and 10-minute sermon in less than 15 minutes. But I encourage you to listen to the whole sermon, for which I will leave a link in the description. Okay, let's get started.
Jason, seeking to bring them out of the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them. And they are acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." Their message that we would call spiritual has implications for the whole world. And they knew it. What's the accusation? I want you to see it again. The accusation is, quote, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." So this is not just in the realm of the spiritual, behind the ears and the walls of the church. The Christian message, they preached it so faithfully that the world understood the implications. We see King Jesus, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, ruler over the kings of the earth. I'm quoting scripture now. We see that in the modern context as, oh, that's for the church. That's our thing over here in this little huddle we have in Bible studies. We like to pretend that Jesus is king over the kings of the earth and Lord of Lords, but we don't really mean that, Mr. President. We don't really mean that, Senator. We don't really mean that, Representative. Isn't it interesting that when this gospel goes down in the first century, this gospel of the kingdom, this gospel of salvation and forgiveness under the authority of Jesus Christ, they understood it. What? You're saying that Jesus has all authority in heaven and on earth right now, and that authority is over Caesar himself? And they understood that's a treasonous statement. You can't say that. You see, these early apostles and Christians understood something about the Great Commission, and that's that it was true. Stop there for a second and think about it just for a moment. The Great Commission, what's it say? Matthew 28, 18 through 20. It says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been, past tense, given to me. That's what Jesus said before his ascension. Before he ascended into heaven, he says that before a very small crowd in pagan Rome, with Caesar with all authority. And these early Christians understood he meant it. Do we believe that? Do you believe it today? That Jesus has all authority today? Is it simply the pithy slogan that I'm always talking about? Or do we actually believe it? Because they clearly believed it to the degree that they were preaching it so faithfully and so clearly that everybody around had ears to hear. And they said, you're saying that he has all authority over every area of life? Even over these guys over here with so much power? Your Jesus has something to say authoritatively to Caesar? Not allowed. That's treason. You can't say that. We know, of course, in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, the famous statement from Peter, as they were told by civil governing authorities to stop preaching in the name of Jesus. The word from the inspired apostle was what? We must obey God rather than men. You understand, of course, that's not allowed. That's not allowed in context where you have tyrants or people who say that they have ultimate authority. For you to say that I must obey God rather than men is for you to display that you believe that there is a transcendent law and authority that everybody must yield and bow to. Well, we need to recognize that God's law is the standard. It goes back to this first premise. Jesus is Lord. That's the start of this conversation. He has lordship and authority over every single area of life. There is nothing outside of the realm of his authority. And so the first step here is to say Jesus has all authority, and it is a basic Christian principle that we must obey God rather than men. And that means that we recognize there is a transcendent law above all fallible human beings. Up the chain of command, all the way to God-ordained government, there is a transcendent law outside of all of us that we must yield to and obey. Jesus is Lord, and God has a law and a standard that must be obeyed. In God's law, civil government is actually supposed to be really small. Really, really small. Civil government has a role in society to do mostly what? Protect victims' rights. Punish evildoers, organize for national defense. And that's about it. That's about it. Wield the sword of justice. We live in a fallen world. Sinners hurt one another. Sinners steal from one another. Sinners kill one another. And the government is supposed to be the one instrument of God that actually, here on earth, justly wields the sword so that there is actually protection of victims and an upholding of victims' rights. It's not saying what government always does, but the law of God has ordained limits to civil government. And do you know what is not prescribed in God's law? Yes, we can tell you exactly the limits. Do you know what is not prescribed in God's law? Mandating cookies. And the government, civil government, has specific rules and a context in which they're supposed to work. And one of the things they cannot do, according to God's law, is command that everybody take an experimental cookie that has very suspicious short-term data that is possibly injuring loads of people that we don't even know what it'll do in the future, the government cannot mandate that you put this cookie into your body. That is a violation of God-ordained limits to civil government. You need to think about the law of God, and not just in terms of God-ordained limits of civil government, but you need to think about what God's law word says about love for neighbor. I want you to see it with your own eyes. Go to the text, Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40. The text says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, this is Jesus, he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." All the law and the prophets are built upon loving God and loving neighbor. And if you say we are called to love God and love neighbor, then you just gave me the entire law of God, which it is built upon those things, and you just gave me the Christian resistance to mandatory cookies. Why? It is love for God and neighbor that requires of me to speak out against the tyranny of being told to put this into your body. Ignore your conscience. Ignore the data. Ignore it all. Ignore what this can do to your neighbors. Ignore it all, and you must take this into your body. I would say love for God and love for neighbor demands of me that I resist something like that, because it violates the God-ordained limits of civil government, and it puts at risk my neighbors. Now let's imagine that we lived in a world where the government was saying, we have a healthy cookie called Joe's Cookie, and you must eat this cookie. If you do not eat this cookie, you will no longer be allowed to work in the military. If you don't eat this cookie, then we're going to shut down your business. If you don't eat this cookie, then you're not going to be able to go shopping in grocery stores or go see shows or gather in large gatherings. You must eat the cookie. Everyone has to eat the cookie. Now, a Christian says, well, God tells me to show concern for the preservation of human life and to love my neighbor. What is your long-term safety data about said cookie? And what if the government said, well, this is a new cookie, but trust us, eat the cookie, it's safe. A Christian who has allegiance to Christ, God's law, and a concern for love for neighbor will say, pause. I'm not against eating cookies. Sometimes cookies can be good. Cookies with, say, 50 years or 40 years of safety data showing that it will not ultimately harm me, my kids, my wife, my family, my neighbors. Those may not be bad cookies. We're not anti-cookiers. But your cookie, let's just speculate here, imagine the world where this was actually happening, but your cookies have no long-term safety data to show me that it's safe for my neighbors. And the short-term safety data is alarming and in many ways very suspicious. Let's imagine that we lived in a world where the government said, you must eat this cookie, don't worry, it's safe. And let's imagine that there was a daily report that you could go to that showed the cookie eating adverse event report. And let's imagine that as of today, the report coming from official sources was that 16,310 people died from eating the cookie. And let's imagine that there were 75,605 hospitalizations of your neighbors and mine who ate the cookie. There were 87,814 visits to urgent care because of eating the cookie. 121,305 doctor office visits for eating the cookie. 7,141 cases of anaphylaxis from eating the cookie. 9,446 Bell's palsy from eating the cookie. 2,415 miscarriages from eating the cookie. 7,868 heart attacks from eating the cookie. 17,619 incidents of life-threatening illnesses from the cookie. 30,631 severe allergic reactions to the cookie. My question is this: do Christians have an obligation to say something about that? Love for neighbor would demand of us that we show concern for the preservation of human life when this is being offered. But what we're saying here is that the government, under God, has no right to tell people to eat the cookie. And it certainly has no right to give fathers and husbands the death penalty and to tell them they can't provide for their families anymore because they don't want to take an experimental cookie with such alarming short-term data. We don't want your cookie, Joe. We don't want your cookie.